I was rinsing the same coffee mug for the third time when my phone lit up on the counter, a pale shard in the dark, and the name on the screen split my breath before the hour could. Michael, my son. The boy I buried 15 years ago under a wind-bent tree where the grass never learned how to grow right. The microwave said 3 a.m, that blunt, superstitious time when the house feels crowded with things you can't see but swear are watching. I had promised myself I'd never answer late calls again. I had promised I'd stop inviting the past to sit at my table and drink my coffee and call itself comfort. But grief is a locksmith with all my keys, and my thumb found the green button before my mind did. "Hello?" I said, and the word cracked like ice under a boot. At first there was only a hush, thin and metallic, a long hallway of nothing, then a breath, not mine, the kind that sounds like someone learning how to be quiet. "Mum?" The voice was soft, a smudge on glass, but it carried the exact break on the M, the little stagger he used to have when he was 8 and his front teeth were too big for his face. I took a step back because the floor pitched under me, because 15 years fell at once and I had no hands free to catch them. "Michael," I said, and it was a bruise and a prayer at the same time. A car drifted by outside, the tyres sighing against wet pavement. The heater shuddered awake. Our old clock clicked like a cricket no one could find. Ordinary sounds tried to pull me back where the rules lived, where numbers can be spoofed, recordings stitched, memories salted into dreams. "If this is a joke," I whispered, "it's cruel." The breath at the other end fluttered, then steadied. "It's me," he said, not confident, not sure, just begging me to believe it so it could stay true. Every part of me that knows how the world works put on its glasses and shook its head. Every part of me that is a mother clawed for proof. "Tell me something only Michael would know," I said, fingers pressed into the counter until the laminate bit back. The hush stretched, and I heard a faint rustle, like someone turning within a small space. Sheets, maybe. Voices you can't hear leaning away to listen harder. "Your red scarf," he said at last. "You left it on the bleachers at my first varsity game, and you pretended you meant to because you were saving our seats, but you were crying, and you didn't want Coach to see." I tasted winter and cheap cocoa and pride so bright it hurt to look at. My throat burned. He wasn't wrong. I was proud, I said. "You looked like the world had finally remembered you." A sound that might have been a laugh moved through the line and broke into static. "I can't stay long," he said. "Please listen, don't go out today. Not until the mail comes. Wait for the letter." It was so strange I almost laughed. A letter, as if the dead had discovered stamps. "What letter?" I asked. "What does it say?" The silence came back thicker, a warm fog pushing under a door. "It explains," he whispered. "I didn't mean—" A click swallowed the rest, like someone put a thumb over his mouth. Panic skittered across my skin. "Michael!" I said too loud. "Baby, where are you?" For a second the line opened, and I heard something that sounded like wind through narrow places, the kind that makes a flute of an old chimney. Then his voice, closer, like he'd leaned into the wire itself. "I heard you," he said. "All those nights, I heard you talk to the picture." I turned toward the hall without meaning to, toward the walls where his life still hung in cheap frames, yearbook smiles and gummy Halloween grins, and the graduation cap I pretended to hate but never boxed. Shame and love braided tight. "If this is real," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm, "tell me about the last day." I didn't know why I asked that. Maybe I wanted to hurt enough to make this impossible, to prove it was a trick. Maybe I wanted him to say anything except the truth. The quiet held still, and then shifted, like time-changed chairs. "It wasn't the last," he said, "just the one you saw." The words were wrong, and right at once, a knot my mind couldn't loosen. "Michael, you—" He rushed me, afraid of losing the little window, the way a child rushes through a door that is closing. "Promise me, Mom, wait for the mail. Do not open the door if anyone knocks before noon. Not the neighbours, not the man in the blue jacket. Wait for the letter. My mouth went dry. I looked at the front door like it had learned a new trick. The dead do not give practical advice, I thought. The dead do not warn you about jackets. One more breath stretched between us, thinner now, and I knew I was about to be alone again with the regular noises, with the story I tell myself when midnight ends. "Are you safe?" I asked. It fell out small, a child's question wearing my voice. He answered the way he used to answer when he'd call from a sleepover and knew I would arrive if I heard hesitation. "I am now," he said, soft as a secret. "Because you picked up." The line went flat, a tired grey that didn't even pretend to be busy. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, phone warm in my palm, heart staggering like it had drunk too fast. Logic walked circles. It drew diagrams, pointed at the obvious. But grief tugged my sleeve and whispered that love can be a radio you forgot you left on, catching a station that belongs to storms. I set the mug down and found my red scarf and wrapped it around my neck, even though the house was warm. When I went to put the jelly back in the fridge, I noticed the jar sitting by the sink, open, the knife streaked blue and sweet. I hadn't made toast, I hadn't taken out bread. But once, a lifetime ago, a boy in my kitchen spread too much jam on everything, a bright mess I always scolded and always licked off my thumb. My legs remembered the hallway before my head did. I walked past the pictures and didn't look at them. I locked the front door, the back door, the side door we never use because it sticks. I checked the windows. I turned on the porch light and then turned it off because I didn't want to make my house a lighthouse for whatever wears blue jackets at dawn. Somewhere near the trees, a dog barked once and decided against it. The world shifted back into place as if nothing had happened. But the air was different, like a room just after someone leaves, heat shaped like a body fading slow. I leaned my forehead to the glass and watched my faint reflection try to breathe for me. It wasn't a joke, I told myself. It wasn't a dream. It was a warning disguised as a wish. And when the mail came, I would know which one. Morning came like a slow bruise, spreading violet behind the blinds as if night had only learned to dim, not leave. And I sat at the kitchen table with my red scarf still looped tight, the phone face down beside the jelly I still hadn't put away, pretending I could outstare the clock to keep it from moving toward whatever noon wanted to be. I told myself I wouldn't open the door, not for anyone, not even for the ghost of my better judgment. And I practiced saying no in a voice that wouldn't sound like a frightened woman in a quiet house. But the word kept thinning on my tongue, so I brewed coffee I didn't need and watched the window for the first sign of a blue jacket, counting the way a child counts thunder between lightning, because math is a small faith I still remember. At 7:14 the porch boards groaned with the certainty of a shoe, and I froze, mug hovering like I was offering it to something I couldn't see, and a neighbour's knuckles stuttered against the door. 3 hopeful taps, a pause, then one more as if she was embarrassed by her own persistence. It was Karen from up the street, voice bright and gentle and nosy all wrapped together, calling my name to say she had mango bread still warm and thought of me. Thought of how I'd once said mornings made everything feel like it could be forgiven. The smell drifted in through the seam around the doorframe, sugar and comfort, and the kind of kindness that always finds a way to keep score, and still I didn't move, didn't answer, just stood there imagining the curve of her mouth collapsing as she realised I wasn't opening, the moment she'd decide I was rude or asleep or worse. After a minute she set the loaf on the mat, said she'd text and left, and I exhaled so hard I swayed, wishing I could explain that a boy I love had told me not to trust anyone until the mail came, wishing that explanation wasn't a sentence that would force me into a smile I didn't have the strength to fake. The house adjusted itself in tiny ways, heat clicking off, pipes deciding not to speak, a hairline creak that moved across the ceiling like a thought, while I tried to remember the sound of Michael's laugh without remembering the ending, and somewhere in that effort my eyes blurred with exhaustion, head heavy, all the edges of the room softening like bread left in rain. I jerked awake to the trill of my phone, the screen lighting with a number I didn't know, and a town 2 states over, and every cell in me begged to decline. But I swiped anyway and said hello, and a man cleared his throat into my ear. Official and casual at once, the way people sound when they want you to agree before you know what you're agreeing to. He said he was with the delivery office, that there was a time-sensitive item addressed to me that required confirmation, and could I verify my full name and birth date, and I felt my scalp crawl with heat because he didn't say post office, and his words leaned too hard on the script, like a chair with one uneven leg. "Leave it on the porch," I said, but he chuckled softly like we were conspiring, said he'd need to hand it to me in person due to new regulations, and before I could answer, the front steps complained again, and a shadow filled the frosted glass, a broad, square shoulder topped with a collar the colour of water under cloud, a blue jacket, vivid even through the distortion, and my breath stopped behaving. "I'm already here," the man said into my ear, the words running a slow finger down my spine, and I didn't hang up so much as let the phone slide from my hand, screen kissing the floor with a plastic sound that felt too human, and I backed away 1 step, then another, until the hallway framed me with our family pictures, strangers' eyes that used to be ours. The knock that followed wasn't polite, 2 flat pounds that meant business, and a voice announced postal service, all wrong, too deep and bored and a shade amused, like a teenager impersonating authority. Another knock, harder, and then a new voice outside, an older woman with morning cheer and a carrier's stomp calling, "Good morning, delivery for, oh ma'am, do you need help?" And the silhouette of blue jerked out of the glass, shoes thudding fast down the steps, a scuff on the sidewalk, the quick friction of fabric as someone turned and fled. I put my ear to the door and heard the real mail carrier mutter something sharp and Midwestern and decisive, then the clink of the mailbox lid, the paper shiver of envelopes finding a bed. I stayed still until I heard her truck cough back to life and roll away, and then I waited longer because fear loves an encore, because the dead had told me patience, and I wasn't going to fail my own son at the first test. At 12 exactly, the clock confessing its little sin of being on my side for once, I unlocked the door with fingers that trembled and pulled it only a hand's width. The chain taut, the world sliced into safe and not yet. And the first thing I saw was Karen's mango bread in a sunlit rectangle. A note on top that said, "You okay?" And then, tucked under the edge like it was hiding from whatever almost happened, a thick white envelope with my name written in a hand I recognised more than any other. The loops and pauses of a boy who never learned to like cursive but wanted to please me. The little ridge in his lowercase "tighty" where he always paused to think. I knelt so fast the chain rattled and took it like it might jump, heart throwing itself against my ribs like a trapped bird, and for 1 second the porch was exactly what it had always been. A place where mail came and neighbours worried and the sun tried its best. Back inside I slid the deadbolt, rested my palm flat against the wood as if that would keep the world out, and sat at the kitchen table where the jelly still waited and the coffee had grown a skin. The envelope had no stamp, no postmark, just my name and a faint smudge of something on the back, like graphite or ash. I turned it over and pressed my nail under the flap, then stopped, thinking of Michael's voice. Wait for the letter. And I realised he hadn't told me what to do with it once I had it, just to wait for it. And I laughed, quick and breathless and a little unhinged, because of course grief would hand me a riddle with the answer hidden inside. I opened it slowly, feeling the fibres give, and slid out a single folded sheet that smelled like old books and something else I couldn't place. Something like wet leaves and hospital corridors and the memory of winter coats. The first line said, "Mom, first, breathe," which I did, because he asked, because the body will accept orders from certain voices even after the world says it shouldn't. If you're reading this, then the door stayed closed and the morning didn't swallow you whole. It continued, and my eyes pooled, and the margins were full of his little arrows and underlines, like he was sitting beside me, explaining how to fix a school project. "The man in the blue jacket is not the last problem," the letter said, and the room leaned, and I gripped the paper hard enough to wrinkle it, because if there was a first problem, there would be a second, and I have never been good at sequels, but it went on anyway. "There is a reason this is reaching you now, and it has everything to do with the day you think was the last." The letter shook a little in my hands, the paper breathing with me, and as I read, the kitchen thinned to just the table, just the chair, just the smell of mango and burnt coffee and the rustle of sentences that knew my house better than I did. "There are two endings to any day," Michael had written in the crooked print he never learned to smooth out. "The one the world sees and the one that keeps moving after the lights go off." And I felt the floor steady under me because something in that line touched the marrow of how I'd survived, how I'd swept and laundered and smiled through the world's ending while the private one kept jolting back to life like a light with a bad switch. 15 years ago, the letter said, what you buried wasn't the whole of me, which made my stomach fold into a fist, because what else could a mother bury but the whole? And yet the ink insisted. There was a fire you know about. You know where I was found. You know the names written on official lines. What you don't know is who arrived first and what they took. And the air around me changed, grew thin, like the letter had opened a door and weather was walking in. "Mum, I'm not a ghost," the next sentence began, and my throat made a sound I didn't recognise, a laugh that burned, because that should have been good news. But it bent toward terror, and I pressed my palm to the table to keep the world from tilting. "I'm in between," he wrote. "Not the way church taught, the other way. The way paper makes a version, and men in coats file it, and someone else walks around with your face." And I saw again the blue jacket, like a bruise in the glass, the call that arrived at the same time as the shadow, and a cold recognition pooled in me like rain, finding the lowest part of the ground. They needed me, the letter said, and when people like that need you, they write the story themselves. And I saw men with clean hands and pens that clicked, rooms where everyone practiced saying protocol, where the air was always a little too dry. "They took me from the ambulance," he wrote, and my mind stumbled, tried to push that image away. And the driver kept going, because sometimes the easiest way to end a question is to finish the drive. And for a second I was back on that day, that siren fading, the neighbour's little theatre of pity playing out on lawns, casseroles cooling into apologies. "I signed up for it," he confessed, "because I thought I was protecting you." And the words blurred and sharpened, because the other option was worse, and I was young enough to think worse had a flaw. And I knew the particular arrogance of boys who love their mothers. They think they can outwit danger by letting it use their names. "You can hate me later," the next line said, "but first you have to listen because the man in the blue jacket wasn't early by accident," and heat moved across my scalp again, needles waking. "There's a case opening," he wrote. "The old paper is tearing. Someone who used to be quiet is talking, and the people who kept the file warm all these years are not fond of drafts." And the house creaked once like it agreed. "You will get another visit," the letter continued, "and not from pretending. They'll have badges that scan and smiles that sit wrong on their faces, and they will ask you kindly to share everything you kept." And my eyes flew to the hallway, to the closet where grief had become a filing system. Scrapbooks, boxed medals, the sweater that still held his ghost, cologne. "They won't mention the phone calls," he said. "They won't admit the letter exists," and I could feel fingerprints all over the edges of my life. "If you let them in now, they will take more than things," the letter warned. "They will take your next days and rearrange them so you forget what belongs to you." And a fresh, clean anger rose in me, quiet as a tide, because I've surrendered enough to the past and I wasn't offering the future too. "Why now?" I whispered to the paper like it could hear beyond the ink, and the answer was there, slant and sure. "Because the man who made the choice for me is dying," Michael wrote, "and dying men reach for clean sheets," which made me think of hospital corridors and waning beeps and hands that had pressed signatures now shaking at the edge of a bed. "He kept a ledger," the letter said, Names, dates, payments, who looked away and who pointed where. And the kitchen seemed suddenly full of people who had passed through my life with friendly waves and unremarkable shoes. "Someone is bringing you a copy," he promised, "but they don't know you yet, so they'll come sideways. A package in someone else's hand, a favour owed, a wrong address that finds its way." And I thought of the mango bread cooling on the mat, the note with its bright ordinary concern, how goodness and danger always knock within an hour of each other. "If I told you this sooner," he wrote, "I'd have put you in their headlights." And the pen had dug a little deeper into the paper there, the loop of the Y torn like he'd pressed hard enough to hurt. "Now they're watching each other," he went on. "Now the safest place for the truth is in a kitchen with an old clock." And I looked up at the clock out of reflex, at the second hand chewing through time as if it had all the answers and none of the appetite. "There is one thing you have to do," he wrote. "Make 3 calls," and my mouth went dry again, because every phone since 3 a.m. had felt like a loaded thing. "First, call the lawyer you stopped calling," and a picture slid into my mind. Ruth, grey hair cut in a neat cap, voice that could make a state trooper apologise for the weather. The woman who sat with me through a wrongful death case that went nowhere, who refused to send a bill for every hour I cried. "Second, call Karen," the letter said, and I, startled, glanced toward the front room like the note could see me doing it. "Because she has a brother you don't know about, and he owes her, and you'll need someone whose job it is to bump mail to the top of the pile." And I thought of Karen's easy gossip tone and how it shaded into grit when someone needed something done. "Third, call the number at the bottom of this page and say the word ledger, and hang up," he wrote, and my eyes slid to the margin where a number waited, simple and black and terrifying in its lack of explanation. "Do not answer unknown calls for the next 48 hours, Michael underlined twice. "Do not open the door to anyone without a name you can repeat to someone else later, and don't wear the red scarf if you go out." And I touched the wool at my throat before he explained, "It's how they've been tagging you in street footage, bright colour, predictable habit, change what you can." And a shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with cold. "Mom," the letter ended, the words softening into white space. "I am sorry for every day I missed and for the way I saved you wrong, but I am trying to save you right now." And beneath that, one last line in smaller letters, like he'd leaned closer to the paper to tell me something forbidden. "Tonight, 3 a.m, if you can bear it, answer again." I dialed Ruth first because the letter said so, and because her number lived in my muscle memory like an old lullaby, and when her voice answered, clean and steady and tilted with alertness the way it gets when she knows a storm's already in the room, I said her name, and felt my own spine return. I told her I had a situation, and she said, "Of course you do. Not cruel, just factual. A woman who builds maps while other people are still describing the weather." And when I told her about the 3 a.m. call, she didn't laugh or caution me back to logic. She said, "What did he tell you not to do?" And I recited the rules and she said, "Good, then keep them." And I kept talking about the letter with no postmark, about the man in the blue jacket, about the almost at the door, and when I said ledger, she stopped me like a crossing guard, breath tight in her nose the way it gets when she's doing math fast. She asked if anyone followed the mail carrier, if I had a camera, if my neighbour left the bread before or after the first knock, and I answered, and she hummed like a tuning fork, then said, "I'll be there in an hour," and I said no visitors, and she said, I heard, and promised she'd call when she turned onto my street, and I should look through the peephole and use the chain and keep my hand on the deadbolt and demand a detail only Ruth would know. Then I called Karen, and she answered breathless, like she'd been moving laundry from one life to another, and when I thanked her for the bread, she said, "Of course," with a little guilt flinch, because she'd felt me not opening the door. I asked about her brother, and the silence flickered, small and wary, and then she said his name the way people say a problem that's earned a chair at Thanksgiving, Calvin, and yes, he works at the distribution centre, and yes, he can make packages appear faster than the algorithm says they should, and yes, he owes her because of a summer in 2009 nobody mentions. "Do you want me to call him?" she asked, and my throat was suddenly afraid of how easy that sounded. So I said not yet, maybe soon. And then I told her I might need her to sit in her car at the corner tonight with her lights off and her eyes wide open, and she said, "Oh," the kind of "oh" that means a person looks down at her own courage, like a shoe she hasn't worn in years, then said, "Okay," and I loved her a little for it. Last, I dialed the number at the bottom of the page with a finger that didn't feel attached to me, the digits plain and waiting like a doorbell, and when the call clicked alive I said the word "ledger," the way you say a prayer in a public place, lips barely moving, and then I hung up because the instructions were a bridge I didn't want to burn by peeking over the side. The house felt suddenly crowded, the air busy with the footprints of all the choices I had just made, and I wanted to lie down on the kitchen floor and measure the tiles with my cheek the way children do when the world is too big. But instead I stood and moved. Mugs to the sink, scarf into a drawer, mail into a stack that wasn't the stack with the letter, locks checked again, blinds tilted to a narrower angle so I could see the street in slivers. When Ruth called from the corner, I took the chain off 2 links, peered through the peephole, and saw her standing square to the door with her driver's licence in one hand and a manila folder in the other like a passport. I opened just enough to see her eye up close, that flinty grey that makes liars tired, and I said, "What did you say to the judge when they tried to close the courtroom on us?" And she said, "I told him sunlight's cheap and disinfectant's expensive." And I let her in because only Ruth could turn anger into a coupon. She stepped past me like the house was also a client and did a fast sweep, not in a cop way, in a mom way, corners, windows, under the table, the back door we never use. And then she washed her hands like she always does, a ritual that turns rooms into offices. We sat, and I slid the letter across the table, and she put on reading glasses that made her look like the idea of justice, and as her eyes moved, her jaw worked, and when she finished she didn't speak right away, which scared me more than words. Finally she said, "He's alive," plain as a spoon, and the sound landed in my chest and detonated slow, sending heat out to the ends of my fingers, and I said, "Don't do that." And she shook her head, corrected herself. He was alive when he wrote this, and we let that sit between us like a hot plate. She asked about the blue jacket man, every detail, and I told her, and she said, "Not a pro," and I wanted that to make me feel better, but it didn't because amateurs panic and panicking men kick down doors. She opened her folder and pulled out a small device that looked like a car key and a pack of gum, stuck it under the table with a little click and said, "If anyone's broadcasting, this will make them regret the electricity." And I didn't ask how legal it was. Then she took a picture of the letter with her phone and slipped the page into a plastic sleeve like it was evidence, which I guess it was, and she said, "The number you called will call back, not with a ring, with a knock that isn't a knock." And when I gave her a look, she said, "A drop." And I said, "I'm a mother with a kitchen, not a spy." And she smiled with half her mouth and said, "Today we are both." And I wanted to cry at the absurdity, but it felt like laughing in church. The day stretched thin and jointed, and when afternoon slanted the light across the floor like a warning stripe, a sedan rolled slow down the block and stopped like it had questions. 2 people got out with the posture of men who have badges in their pockets and lies rehearsed in their throats, and Ruth was already moving, hands empty, face bland, voice bright as a PTA greeting as she stepped onto the porch and pulled the door behind her until only an inch of light showed, and I stood inside with my ear tucked to the seam and listened to her greet them by rank without being told, a neat trick that made one of them clear his throat. They asked for me and said words like ongoing inquiry and closure for families and revisiting past determinations, and Ruth told them I wasn't accepting visitors and all questions should be routed to her office, and did they have a card that wasn't printed at a copy centre, and the way their silence fell told me those badges were as real as their smiles. When they left, Ruth exhaled like a tire, then whispered through the crack, "They'll be back." And I whispered, "I know." And the clock answered with its little cricket click. At dusk, Karen texted a single word, "Ready?" And I told her yes, and to bring nothing bright. And an hour after dark, a bicycle rolled by and dropped a small padded envelope at the foot of my steps like it was returning something ordinary. And Ruth waited a beat and then used a broom to pull it inside, and we opened it with kitchen scissors and found a thumb drive and a photograph so old the paper was turning towards sepia. Michael on a gurney, eyes open, one hand curled around a corner of a blanket like he was holding on to a thread he meant to follow, and behind him a man with a clean jaw and a pen clipped to his coat like a flag. On the back of the photo a single name and the word Ledger again, underlined twice. The house seemed to lift off its foundations, just a fraction, like it was remembering how to float, and Ruth said, "Now we move," and I said, "Tonight?" and she said, "Tonight," and the red scarf in the drawer felt like it was breathing. Ruth said tonight like a verdict, not a plan, and I felt the world nudge forward, the house easing off its haunches as if it had been waiting for someone to say go. We packed fast and small, thumb drive taped inside an empty tea tin, the photograph slid behind the cardboard of a picture, frame of me at a beach 30 years ago, cash from the coffee can under the sink, a different coat that didn't know my shape yet, and I left the red scarf in the drawer with a little ceremony, fingers lingering on the wool the way you touch a sleeping pet you can't take with you. Karen texted that she was parked 2 houses down with her lights off and a thermos she didn't need, which made me want to cry for reasons that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with being loved by the ordinary. Ruth cracked the back door with a knife tip and listened to the night as if it had grammar, then nodded once and we slipped out, the 3 of us moving like a sentence with missing words. No porch light, no talk, just breath and the hum of a neighbourhood pretending to be asleep. The sky had that thin, sour colour cities get after midnight, and somewhere a TV laughed at a joke no one would admit they were still watching. Ruth chose alleys and side yards, a route that smelled like dirt and fence wood, like the lives of people I only knew by the way their laundry hung. And when we cut across the old schoolyard, the swings ticked once. Wind or memory, I couldn't tell. Halfway to Ruth's car, a shape unpeeled from a hedge, and I felt my heart crawl toward my mouth, but it was just a cat with a torn ear and a look that said it had learned long ago that humans are weather, and it let us pass with bored permission. Ruth's sedan was the colour of nothing, that kind of nondescript you forget even while you're looking at it, and when we slid inside, seatbelts quiet, she handed me a knit cap and told me to tuck my hair, then dialed a number from memory and said 2 words, "Route Lantern." And the line went dead in a way that meant it had heard. She drove like a person who trusts maps more than luck, eyes always 2 turns ahead, while Karen narrated the rear view in a calm whisper like a podcast about staying alive. The plan, such as it was, unfolded in pieces between us. A place that wasn't a place. A church basement that pretended to be a yoga studio on Tuesdays. A room that smelled like lemon cleaner and decades of apologies, where a laptop that wasn't anyone's would meet a drive that belonged to too many people, and a man named Jonah, who once taught high school physics and now moved through the systems like a rumour, would make the ledger speak. We hit 3 lights that refused us and one that waved us through like it knew our names, and when a pair of headlights slid in behind us and stayed there for 2 turns too long, Ruth changed streets the way a magician changes coins, her voice even, "We have a tail," and Karen, without drama, said, "Blue jacket," which made me half laugh, half choke. The car behind us was a late model SUV with dealership paper plates, the kind of new that advertises itself, and I watched its teeth in the mirror and felt the old me, the one who drives to work and waves at neighbours and cries over. Commercials slide deeper into the closet of my mind. Ruth didn't speed, she flattened, became the law's favourite student, blinkers exact, stops patient, and that restraint felt like violence we were inflicting on whatever hunted us. When she turned into the lot behind St. Bart's and killed the lights, the SUV breezed past with studied indifference, a shark pretending it had somewhere better to be, and Karen exhaled a laugh that shook at the end. The door to the basement opened to Ruth's knock pattern. 3, 2, 1, a pause, then 2. And the man who let us in had a face so plain it looped back around to memorable, eyes that had seen too much and filed it under later. "I'm Jonah," he said, quiet like the room, and he led us downstairs that complained in old wood syllables to a table already laid with a laptop, a sprig of basil in a jelly jar, and a plate of cookies that made me love whoever still believes sugar can influence fate. I handed over the tea tin with a reluctance that surprised me, some animal part of me wanting to hoard the evidence like a mother fox moving kits, and Jonah took the drive with fingertips careful as a surgeon's, slid it into a reader, and turned the screen so we could ache together. At first, nothing. Then the kind of pro forma folder structure that looks like it has nothing to hide, and Jonah murmured, in a way that meant he recognised the arrogance of whoever built it. He typed like he was persuading instead of commanding, and slowly an index ghosted into view, columns with names that rhymed with authority, dates that mapped against the worst calendars of my life, line items that said who signed and who was told, and who pretended not to hear. And there, like a knuckle pushing through sand, was Michael's date, his street, the entry marked transfer of custody, triage diversion. A phrase so clinical it wiped my mouth clean of moisture. Line after line laid out a story so tidy it made me nauseous. Boys with bad luck and good faces, mothers with jobs they couldn't afford to lose, doctors with ambition, ambulances that learned detours by heart, payments recorded not as money but as considerations, faculty appointments, grants, vacations in places that don't advertise. Ruth took pictures with fingers that didn't shake and sent them to a place in her phone called Freezer, and I watched her make ice cubes out of hell. We reached the bottom of one page and Jonah swore under his breath, not a word, a sound like a seam splitting, and pointed to a subfolder with a woman's name I knew as well as my own. The ER doctor who held my hand when they led me into the small room with the soft chairs, the one who said, "We did everything," and meant we did what we were paid to do, and my stomach folded on itself like someone had kicked it. Karen squeezed my knee under the table once, a pulse of human in a world gone procedural. The door at the top of the stairs shivered. Just a hair, wood telling a story about weight, and everyone's eyes lifted at once. Jonah closed the laptop in a motion so smooth it had to be muscle memory and slid it into a drawer that didn't have a handle until his thumb found the trick, and he pulled the bulb string, and the basement obliged with darkness that smelled like old hymns. Footsteps came down slow. 1, 2, 3. The cadence of people who don't worry they'll be caught, and a man's voice said, "Evening, Pastor." The question stretched thin until it was a threat wearing church clothes. Ruth's hand found mine in the dark, bones small and sure, and Karen's breath steadied beside me like she'd decided to be a metronome. Jonah said nothing, which terrified me more than anything he could have said, and the footsteps stopped on the last stair and turned toward the room's soft heart, ready to gather what they believed was theirs. The phone in my pocket vibrated one brief pulse, not a call, a message, the hour stamped at the top, 2:59 a.m., and then the screen lit with a number I'd already memorised in the place your body uses when it decides to remember without asking you. 3:20 a.m. arrived like a blade sliding home, and in the quiet between their arrival and whatever came next, my son called again. "How many total words do you want in the script?" He didn't say hello this time. He said my name like a rope thrown across water, and the men at the foot of the stairs turned their heads toward the sound, not seeing the light in my pocket, but feeling the way the room changed when a voice knows where to land. "Mom, don't speak," Michael breathed, and I didn't, not because I'm obedient, but because fear had gone quiet in me, a creature holding its own breath. The taller man stepped forward and said my last name in a pleasant way that made the air itch, and Jonah answered from the dark in a voice that belonged to someone who'd been a pastor once and decided to keep the authority. "Evening," he said. "Service is Sundays." And the shorter one laughed, a little too loud, which told me he was the one you could make rush. "Ledger," Michael whispered inside the phone, and the word felt like it woke something in the walls. Ruth squeezed my fingers, a pulse that meant move when I say, and the taller man said they were just checking the property after a call about suspicious activity, and Jonah hummed like a man agreeing with a lie to see if it grows. On 3, Michael said, drop the phone. I didn't understand why until he added, they're trace-leaning your signal, make it travel, and I palmed the phone flat and slid it across the concrete, the glass a little puck that kissed the far wall and lit a sliver under a bookcase. The men pivoted toward the glow as if pulled, and Ruth's hand left mine, and in that blink Jonah yanked a cord I hadn't seen, and a trap of old church theatre came down. The folding. Partition wall they used to make rooms out of rooms, and it dropped with a clatter that gave us 4 seconds and a hallway to the side door. Karen grabbed my sleeve, and the 3 of us threaded the black like we'd practiced in a dream, skirting the edge of a stage where children once forgot their lines. And Jonah, God bless him, stepped into the men's flashlight beam with his palms up like an usher ready to seat them. We hit the door, and it stuck the way wood does when it's argued with humidity, and for the 1 second we wrestled it. I felt the big man's attention turn, felt the heat of it land on my spine, and then the door gave with an old house groan, and we were in a narrow alley that smelled like soft garbage and rain. Left, Michael said in my pocket, the voice tinny now, bouncing off tin, then right, then stop, no farther, count 3 recycle bins, and wait. And I did, because his directions had never once let me get lost when he was small and the mall felt like a forest. We flattened between a dumpster and a fence, breath loud, hearts learning a drum, and behind us the stairwell exploded with male voices trying to sound calm. I could feel Ruth reaching for something in her jacket and then not using it, choosing patience over noise, and Karen mouthed, "Okay?" And I nodded like I believed it. "When you hit the chain link," Michael said, "don't climb. There's a dog. He'll sing the whole world awake. There's a hatch low to the ground. Slide." And I wanted to ask how he knew, but there it was, a little square used for deliveries, half rotted and perfect, and we belly scraped through, coats grabbing at old nails, backs collecting the smell of 100 rainy Thursdays, and emerged in a courtyard no one claimed. Jonah joined us 2 minutes later with a look that said both men were temporarily engaged with a story about faulty wiring and a deacon who didn't exist, and he handed me my phone like it had been baptized and returned. "You're up," he told Michael into the speaker, and my son said, "It's time," which made me choke on air. "Mum," he said, "you asked about the last day. This is the last day of the old version." And I felt the ground turn beneath us, a carousel finally deciding to stop. Sirens moved somewhere, indifferent, and Jonah pulled the laptop from a messenger bag none of us saw him acquire, opened it on a crate, and slotted the drive again. The ledger blinked awake, unafraid now, and Jonah began a push. Not to one place, but to many. Reporters whose outboxes he already lived in, prosecutors who owed him favours they didn't know they owed, teachers who still taught kids to ask why. Names slid like spilled salt across the screen, and for a moment the courtyard felt crowded with all the people who'd look at this and feel their stomachs collapse. "Back up," Ruth said, and he nodded, a constellation of uploads lighting as if the sky had decided to be honest. The church door slammed open behind us, and the men came hard this time. None of the polite left. And Karen, who had always been the neighbour who remembered your birthday and your trash day, stepped into their path with her thermos held like a staff and said, "No," using the voice she saved for sons who were about to ruin their lives, and they stumbled. Not their feet, their certainty. And in that stutter, Ruth produced a paper I recognised from the years when grief tried to teach me law, an injunction that did not belong here but somehow did. Language about property and privacy and seizure limits, and she recited it like a spell, each clause a fence post. One man sneered that the paper was stale, and she said, "So are your manners?" And that made him step too close and too fast, which was the second mistake, because Jonah's friend, who had been a shadow at the edge of the courtyard, decided to be a person with a camera. And I learned that night the only thing bullies hate more than laws is light. My phone vibrated again, once, twice, steady, and Michael said, "When the clock hits 3:10, leave." And I looked at the screen and saw 3:09 burning down and realised the timing wasn't superstition. It was a window in the systems that track us, a maintenance minute when data hiccups and eyes go blind. The second hand licked the top, and the exact taste of 3:10 slid into the air, and the world softened at the edges like a lens with grease on it, and we moved. Out the back gate, into a car not ours, seats already warm, engine already humming. Jonah stayed, not bravely exactly, efficiently, and Karen drove because her hands were the steadiest, and Ruth called a number and said, "Open the basket." And somewhere servers received what we'd given and began to feed it to mouths that could bite. "You're going to think about what ifs," Michael said, voice smaller now, farther. "Don't. There are too many to count, and not one will put sleep in your bones. Go home through the streets that are ugly in daylight. Ugly protects you." And we did, slipping along the spine of warehouses and the ribs of loading docks, passing men who live with their backs to tomorrow and don't ask questions that make Dawn nervous. When we reached my block, the blue jacket was back. Not the man, the idea of him. 2 cruisers, a city car, the look of a scene preparing to own you. And Ruth said, "Not tonight." And we flew past, circled, found the alley, and slid in my side door like the house had always had a second mouth. It was almost gentle, the way the quiet returned. Karen stood in my kitchen and cried once, a single neat sob that left her lighter. Ruth filed the last of the evidence in the freezer, then looked at me with a softness I'd forgotten she possessed. "He bought you time," she said, "so take it," and she hugged me in that brisk, efficient way of women who love and schedule at once. When they left, the house exhaled and the clock resumed being a tired cricket. I turned the red scarf over in the drawer like a relic and didn't put it on. At 3:29, the phone buzzed a final time and his voice came faint, wrapped in distance. "They will say it's complicated," he said, "but it's simple. When the choice is between paper and people, choose people." And I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "On my way to the version where I can come home." And then the line thinned to a wire and broke. Dawn found me at the table with my palms flat, the letter beside my coffee, the world outside already inventing its explanations. By noon, the Ledger had made morning shows flinch. By evening, the ER doctor's name was a headline. By night, the man with the pen on his coat had vanished into an investigation that smelled like bleach. I fed Karen and I sat with Ruth, and we let Jonah be a rumour. And when, a week later, a doorbell rang at a decent hour, and a man stood there with a jaw like my father's and eyes like all the good days I'd tried not to remember, I didn't open blindly. I asked him what he took and what he returned, and he said, "I took your last day, and I'm returning your next." And I made him say it twice, because I intend to believe carefully for the rest of my life.